All right, guys, Dieter again, Beer Idiots. Today I have one of the leading figures in English writing about beer. He's the author of The Beer and the Food Companion. He is also the co-author with Tim Webb in the World Atlas of Beer and has done 2 editions of the Pocket Beer Guide. Welcome, Stephen Beaumont.
That's a pleasure.
Hello. How are you doing in these days?
Quiet. I live in the heart of downtown Toronto, which has been very quiet lately. A lot of people working from home, so not a lot of activity around downtown. I keep looking to my left because I automatically look out the window onto the what are normally very busy streets, and they're just not busy at all. So my wife and I are in our 16th floor condo, and we don't go out much. We, eat and drink and try to stay occupied.
Is it a good time to be a busy bee and write a lot of new lecture now?
Theoretically, yes. In practice, it's a funny time to be a writer because it's very difficult to get that kind of inspiration and get rolling on something. I find myself with a lot of half-finished stories. A few book concepts that I've been working on, but Tim and I just finished the new edition of the World Atlas of Beer.
Oh, cool.
That will be coming out this fall, hopefully in several languages, including Dutch. And right now we're going back over all the proofs of it to make sure that everything is as current as it can possibly be before we go to press.
Let's start a little bit more in the beginning. Did you start your career as a journalist and then a writer, or what is your background?
Well, I started my career as a political scientist. But no great interest in pursuing political science. So what I ended up doing was focusing on freelance writing, which led me into a few columns that I did for local newspapers. And then after a while from there, I just gravitated into beer because beer was something that fascinated me. I wanted to be a writer, and I figured that specialization was a good way to go. So that's what I did.
About which year are we talking now?
I started writing about beer in 1990.
Yeah, all right. How was it then in those times in the 1990s? Internet wasn't that huge. Blogging didn't exist that much. So tell me a bit about that.
I used to fax my columns into the newspaper. Or I would take a 5 1/8, the old floppy disks, the big ones, the big floppy disks. I used to take one of those down to my editor sometimes. For overseas publications or down in the US, I would mail them discs. So it wasn't the instantaneous world that it was. I remember I had a conversation about 3 years after starting writing about beer with a wine writer. And I said to him, when did you really start getting respect for what you do? And he said, when he wrote his first book. So about a week later, I started planning this book, which was my very, very first book. There it is. Great Canadian Beer Guide, 1994. That's a very young me right there.
Okay.
We just kind of went from there, and the new edition of the World Atlas is going to be my 15th book.
Yeah, we also interviewed Tim Webb 1 year ago in the World Brew Forum in Antwerp then, and he talked a bit about that there is coming a new version of the book, but that everything now in the craft scene and in the beer scene in general is going so fast that it's almost impossible to catch up on that. What are the main challenges for you guys as writers? How do you try to catch up on that? Or is that the conclusion? You cannot catch up, but this is scenarios that we think that will happen? Or
Well, I mean, especially now, right? In this current state, we're looking at a situation where it's entirely possible some of the breweries we write about won't exist by the time the book comes out. So it's very tricky. We are updating the manuscript pretty much weekly, going towards publication, and we will continue to do that until we go to print. So it will be as current as it can possibly be.
And in the book, you describe a lot of bars, venues, and brewers, but what is the percentage that you do the field research, or how with which actors do you work together to get that data qualitative?
Well, and again, in normal circumstances, Tim and I travel almost constantly. So I'm on the road probably 3 or 4 months out of the year in total. And Tim's probably as much or more so. So we spend a lot of time researching, visiting breweries, visiting festivals, talking to people. We have what we call our beer spies all over the world, who we talk to on a regular basis to keep up with what's going on in their areas.
Yeah.
And then we just corroborate all that information. We split up the world. So Tim does most of Europe. I do all of the Americas. We split up Asia. I do Australasia in this book. And then we go over each other's work. So everything's read over by each of us 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. All right. Cool. And tell us a bit one of the last books you wrote, the Beer and Food Companion. What is the story behind that?
Well, the second book I wrote was called A Taste for Beer, and that came out in 1995. And a lot of it was about pairing beer and food, which was something I got into very early on. I think back in 1993 it was. Yeah, it was 93. I hosted a beer and chocolate tasting. Now, if you can imagine going into a bar in Canada in 1993 and telling people, oh yeah, beer goes with chocolate.
Whoa.
So it was a really interesting experience. That fascinated me. So I did more and more and more about that. And then Taste for Beer was always one of my favorite of my books. So I decided, I want to redo this, but I want to make it a lot better. So for the Beer and Food Companion, I went back into history. So I talked about historic relationships with beer and food. And then, your standard stuff about some basic beer and food pairing rules. And then from there, I just had a little fun with it. There's some charts, there's some graphs, there's some, unusual ideas. I went to chefs all over the world and I got recipes from them. So there's a bunch of recipes scattered throughout the book as well.
Yeah, all right. So you started writing books because of a conversation you had with a colleague and the inspiration from there. What is now the percentage in, do you still do freelance writing? Do you have your columns, or is it now you're fully a book author?
No, I do regular columns. I write about spirits as well. So in fact, my most recent book is this one, which I co-authored with a woman named Christine Sismondo here in Toronto. And we covered every distillery in Canada, all across the country. So I do spirits writings. I'm a regular columnist for Whiskey Advocate magazine. Oddly enough, I took my beer and food pairing and changed into whiskey and food pairing as well. So I do a whiskey and food pairing column for them, as well as my regular column. I write for some industry publications. I do some consulting on time to time for hospitality, for bars and restaurants, and travel around the world and help judge competitions, give lectures. I've been spending a lot of time in Latin America in the last year, 3 years really, because I think it's a really exciting scene down there. There's a lot happening in Latin America. So I've spoken at I think 4 or 5 conferences down there, try to help the Latin brewers get moving forward and just really getting their craft up to the level that it can be.
Yeah, because Latin America, we also interviewed people there. There is a huge market, but also the wood and spices and herbs that they have natively there in the country is perfect to discover to brew in beer and spirits.
It's actually quite amazing the way that they brew with external flavorings. They approach it in a way that's the closest it comes is Belgian. Because when a North American brewer adds an ingredient to a beer, they do something like, okay, we have this imperial stout, and then we're going to add vanilla beans to it and put it into a barrel. Whereas when a Latin American brewer does it, they see all the ingredients as being equal. So that vanilla bean becomes as important as the hops, as important as the malt, as important as the water. And it gives them this ability to make these extraordinary flavored beers.
Yeah. Also, what did you saw change? You mentioned you started in the early 90s already with writing. Since then, I think the biggest revolution in the writing scene is the internet. How did that affected the writing, the newspaper business for people with columns like you?
Well, it certainly has changed. The last 20 years are dramatically different. Unfortunately, there are fewer magazines, there are fewer newspapers. If you're a freelance writer, you're probably getting paid about the same as you were back in the mid-1990s. So, beer's more expensive, food's more expensive, but they pay the same amount. I was actually blogging before blogging was a word. I had a website called World of Beer back in the late 90s. And ran that for a number of years. Eventually, I just, it was one of those things that kind of burned itself out. I think all bloggers tend to burn out eventually unless they start generating some revenue from it. So I was updating it monthly, and then it started getting a little less than monthly. And then eventually I sold the URL to an American company which was running a chain of restaurants called World of Beer. So I sold that to them, and now I'm online as BeaumontDrinks.com.
Okay. So you sold that project.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is it also content-wise that content still sells good over the internet, the writing, or is in the early days of the internet stealing texts was a big issue and stuff? Is that now more professionalized with modern technology, let's say photo tracking and stuff like that? Do you get more honest paid for your work than in the beginning of the internet?
Definitely it's better than in the early stages of the web, because back then nobody was paying for online advertising. Now at least you have people who do pay for online advertising, which allows the money to flow through to the writers a bit more. But it's not anywhere close to where it was when I was writing at the heyday of magazines.
Yeah. To pick a little bit in on the revenue thing and the modern media. Myself, I'm an IT consultant. I always think digitally first and paper last. Is something like ebooks spoken in or digital books something on the market you're thinking on or already did?
I have not done an ebook myself. I know people who have, and they seem to be. If you hit a particular niche, there's a possibility. For me, the books that I've seen of mine that have been converted into ebooks have not really worked that well. So I think you have to have a very specific subject matter that clicks with an audience, because the ease of publishing in ebook is of course fairly easy rather than publishing paper and distributing paper and all this kind of stuff. Yes. But at the same time, the revenue you're making from it is a lot less.
Okay. Yeah, so it's still paper sells,
Yeah,
of
paper
course.
sells, and something like the World Atlas of Beer, it it it's a beautiful book, and that's not me. That's the designers at the publisher,
Yeah.
and they source the photos and they make it into something that is absolutely gorgeous, which just doesn't communicate on an e-version.
Yeah, correctly. And let's talk about languages. You write only English, I assume?
I write only English. Depending on when you catch me, I can be fluent in French.
Ah, bonjour,
But
comment vas-tu?
usually I need a couple of days immersed in the language to be able to converse freely. But my written French has always sucked, so I do not write in French.
Yeah.
Although Google Translate's a very helpful thing.
Yeah. But is that something, if you want to reach a certain market, is English still king in the beer scene where you are in? Or is it also that you now publish, it would be beneficial to publish also in Spanish or in other languages?
Well, this is where translators come in, and if
Hmm.
I'll just lift up my computer, I'll show you behind me. Over there, that side. Um, where's the camera? The World Atlas of Beer, which is at the top shelf there,
Hmm.
has been published in many different languages, including Russian, Dutch, Norwegian, Mandarin, Japanese. So what the publisher does is the publisher will contact foreign markets, and they'll buy the rights to the book, do the translation. So they use the original design of the book, but with all their own text.
But is that something that is a big piece of the pie, the foreign
No,
languages, or is English still 80% of the pie?
English is still the big part of the pie,
Okay.
and part of that is that English is the ubiquitous language in the world today. When world leaders get together, they default to English. When beer judges get together, we default to English. It's actually at a point where it gets to feel kind of guilty when you're an English speaker, because you have all these people around you who
Yeah.
English is their second or third language, and they're all speaking your language, and it's like, oh, I don't even have to work. you know. So I try. I'm actually not bad at picking up languages, so I can understand some Spanish, I can understand some Dutch, some German, some Italian. I can't really contribute to a conversation, but if I focus in on it, I can follow along.
Yeah, yeah. What are some works or concepts of books that you now have in your work in progress? Are there still some pearls to be crafted?
Uh, Currently, I'm not working on anything specific. I just have some ideas that I'm tossing around in my head. Every once in a while, I communicate with my publisher, and she says, "Okay, this is something you could work out," or "No, forget it, Stephen. It's never going to work." So that's the way the book writing thing works. Just
And
come up with ideas and.
you always keep to that strictly. It's like if the publisher gives a no-go, you don't start a draft on the side to see what comes out of it later.
I can go to another publisher. Right now, like the Beer and Food Companion was not with the same publisher as the World Atlas of Beer, because they're two publishers with different styles.
Hmm.
The Canadian Spirits book is a Canadian book, so that's a different publisher as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So I like to stick to just a core of publishers that I work with, but I do have an agent in the U.S., and if I had an idea that I really think this is something I want to do, I can take it to her, and she'll shop it around to other publishers and work from there.
Yeah. As a book, as a beer book writer, then what is the biggest challenge that people might have?
I think the biggest challenge is something that the author just can't control at all, and it's distribution.
Okay.
You know, with the World Atlas, we talked a little bit about Latin America. Latin America is a huge market. There are a lot of people down there, and craft beer is growing quickly. But trying to get a Spanish and Portuguese version of the World Atlas readily available throughout Latin America is a challenge. So it's one of those things where I know people want to buy this book, but somehow the publisher has to work to make that available to them. And that's the greatest challenge, I think.
Yeah. Still distribution. And that's not where you take things more in your own hand and release digital versions, like what I in my mind would do as a digital person.
Yeah, it's there's certainly a market that is something I could explore at some point. Right now, I'm viewed as a bit of a dinosaur because I do make paper books rather than digital books. But it's, I have no interest in self-publishing. The publishers that I work with are very good at what they do. And I feel it's a fair trade for them to take part of the money in order to make a beautiful book that I can be proud of. If I was going to do an ebook, I'd still have to work with a digital specialist so that it came out looking like a good book, and then the revenues for that book would be less. So it's all a matter of trying to figure out whether, because it's an enormous amount of work to write a book. And if you work it out in per hour wages, I'm probably getting paid about 1/16 of the minimum wage. It's ridiculous, but it's immensely satisfying to actually have that book in your hand at the end of the day.
Yeah. Are there also a concept that we in Belgium have a lot have with authors, probably also in Canada, not per se in the beer sector? Is like you are, let's say, a comedian and you want to be taken a bit seriously. You go to a ghostwriter with a concept about your life or something. You do a couple of talks with them. They record some audio, and then they ghostwrite you a good book. And then in the media, you're always not seen as, oh, you're the starting boy. No, you're the author of a book and you're somebody. Do those people also already knocked at your door like, hey, Stephen, I want a book about something in my sector?
No, I haven't seen that. I know colleagues who have written books mostly for chefs, because especially a few years back, there was a big boom in the market for chefs writing about their craft. And I know that there are a few brewery books that are out that way, but to my knowledge, there have been a couple of books that are, so-and-so with another writer. So it would be the brewer or the brewery owner with the guy who actually put together the words is the title credit. But I don't know of anybody who's ghost written for a brewer.
Yeah, okay, clear. Is there anything, personal question more, is there anything you regret writing? Like, oh, this was too big or this was too, I'm miscalculated that chapter.
As a writer, you're never satisfied with what you end up with. So, if I said I was completely happy with everything that I've had published, I'd be lying through my teeth. But you also have to become comfortable with the idea that this is the truth. You're never going to be happy with it. So, you try not to live with regrets. You try not to say, oh, I should have done this, or I wish I had done that. There was one book I did I was involved in a restaurant in Toronto for a while called Beer Bistro. And through a curious route, the chef and co-owner and I ended up writing a cookbook. And I was responsible for the text mostly, because the chef obviously did all the recipes, and then I made the recipes into a format that a home cook could actually follow. And somehow, through all of the editing, through all of the checking this and that and the other, There was a beer brined chicken recipe that ended up being published without using salt as an ingredient. Brining without salt is just not going to work.
Yeah.
That was one I'd like to have back.
Yeah. All right. So you lived a good part of your life, and now also in Toronto, Canada, but you travel a lot. You said, how is the Canadian craft scene in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
It's extremely good here. Canada has probably now, I'd say, in excess of 1,000 breweries. That number, of course, may drop after this whole COVID mess is over with, because I'm sure that some brewers just aren't going to make it. But that, on a per capita basis, it's actually more than the United States, because we have about 1/10 the population of the U.S. And the U.S. is sitting at about 8,200 breweries now. So we're doing fairly well in terms of number, and we're doing extremely well in terms of quality. I have no trouble taking Ontario beer to places around the world and saying, "Hey, you should try this. This is exceptional." Last fall, I went to Australia, and I hung out with a a writer there named Matt Kierkegaard, and I brought him over some beer. And he was just opening one after the other, and he was very impressed by what he was tasting. So I think that although Canadian beers aren't really known around the world now, they deserve to be known around the world.
Does Canada follows the international trends? Like we had the very strong Imperial Stout, then we had the hazy IPAs, then we had the milkshake IPAs, now a bit more lower alcohol. How is that trend catching up?
There's a certain degree of trend following, which I think is true anywhere in the world. You go to Vietnam and you're going to see trend following of brewers there. It's just one of those things. But at the same time, brewing in Canada can be very regional as well. Out in the West Coast, in British Columbia, they're strongly influenced by what happens south of the border, so the Pacific Northwest. Okay. That was where their inspiration came from. In Quebec, a lot of the inspiration came from Belgium.
Oh.
Quebecois brewers were very strongly inspired by Belgium. In Ontario, for years and years, we had very strong traditional beer styles, like Pilsner, Pale Ale, Nut Brown Ale. You could get perfect examples of all the traditional styles, but very little experimentation. And that's changed in about the last 10 years. So we have a lot more experimentation going on. Some of it good, some of it bad, as ever. But, there's a lot different happening in every province across the country. Trends come and go, but it's the lasting stuff that I think you're really measured by when people look at your marketplace and say, "Hey, you know what? This is really cool. They're doing some really interesting stuff here."
Yeah. And brewery-wise, which one are you say this is something very new coming from Canada in terms of style and ingredients?
Well, it's funny. One of the lectures I give to brewing conferences around the world it's mainly for emerging beer markets. And I talk about the importance of having a style that is your own national style. So, for example, in Brazil, I talked about using Amazonian ingredients to really make a Brazilian statement on beer. In Mexico, I talked about, first of all, using Mexican spices, like mole spices, and then talking about using tequila wood and agave wood and mezcal wood to influence the beers that way. And then I always get the question at the end of those lectures is, so what's Canada's beer style? And we don't have one. We just have not got it going yet. I keep challenging brewers. I keep saying, come on, you got to come up with something that I can say, hey, this is Canada's contribution to the world of beer, but nobody has yet.
To begin on that lecture, why is that important? Why do I need to have my national identity in my beer?
Because I think that, well, there are two obvious answers. One is for export markets. I mean, if you want to send your beer to any country, why do you want to send another IPA or another hazy pale ale? If you want to have an export market, you've got to have something that's different. And the other thing is, I think there's a lot of credibility to be gained with a domestic audience if you're saying, hey, this is Brazilian beer, this is Mexican beer, this is what we're all about. And that builds pride, and that pride builds sales. So I think that it's a very good way of looking at the market, and in terms of how to get people excited about your beer, especially when 98% of your beer is really pale, really flavorless lager that's served really cold. How do you convince someone to try a beer that's flavored with Amburana wood?
Yeah.
You have to say, hey, this is Brazilian. This is something that's exciting. It's us.
Yeah, indeed. In terms of numbers a bit and the economics behind Canada, the Canadian beer scene, does Canada export a lot? Are there breweries with huge export numbers, or is it more locally consumed? Is it a very local market?
It's very much a local market. One of the reasons that Canadian beer is not known around the world is that Canadians aren't really big exporters of our beer. You'll find some small breweries that are exporting small amounts to places like Spain, France, bit in the United States. But generally speaking, there are like 2 or 3 breweries that export significant quantities, and then a handful that do fairly decently down in the U.S. Mostly through the importing company called the Shelton Brothers in the U.S. They handle some Quebecois brewers.
Yeah, and it's because of they're not used to do that in a mindset, or it's more the cost and the taxation, or
yes. It's all of that. I think I don't think that a lot of the brewers are really excited about exporting because they don't see the potential. Especially with the drink local ethos that is the rule nowadays. People kind of look at it and say, well, shouldn't we just focus on getting Canadians to drink our beer rather than getting Spaniards or Chinese or Brazilians to drink our beer? So you do, as I said, you do get some small amounts of exports going out, but I'd really like to see more because I'd like Canadian better impact on the stage. Because as I say, I think that it deserves it.
Yeah. Is Canadian beer then also produced with a lot of local ingredients? Like, is there something like Canadian hop, or is there something, malt, of course, but
well, malt is the obvious one. Canada grows an awful lot of grain. So that would make a lot of sense for us to. In fact, I've been talking with a co-owner of a chain of beer bars out west about doing a competition to develop a specific Canadian style of beer. And our thinking is, malt makes the most sense, to find something that you can really hang a malt hat on. Unfortunately, malt's not sexy in beer right now. Hops are and yeast is, but malt's not really a thing to talk about. So I don't know where we're going to end up with that. There are some hops being grown in Canada, in the interior of British Columbia, in Ontario, and in Nova Scotia. All have some hop farms. I think Quebec has a few small hop farms as well. Nothing has really happened that's terribly exciting with hops yet in Canada, but I can see down the road when they start to really, because it's still early years, so when they start to develop hops that are really suited to our climate, to our geography, to our soils, I think you may start hearing about a specific Canadian hop within 5 years or so.
Yeah, okay. To come back on the malt, I remember the World Brewers Forum in Antwerp last year. There was also a panel discussing the influences of malt on the beer taste, and that they, if you do farming with types of ground, typical strains of grain, that you can make a difference in a beer. But indeed, that malt, that grains are not sexy. How do you? First question: is that something that is going to be changed, and how will that be?
Will it be changed? I don't know. I've become recently a big convert to subtleties of malt through actually some very interesting experiments that have been done locally with Canadian malts versus Czech malts versus German malts. And exact same recipe, exact same brewing technique, but you change your malt and you really change the profile of the beer. But the question is how to convey that to the beer drinker. Like, it's easy to say, hey, this is a Citra beer, and all of a sudden you get blasted in the face with Citra aromas and flavors. But how do you say, hey, this is a subtle kind of a lemony straw as opposed to a more breakfast cereal type maltiness in this Pilsner? That's a tough one to convey. So it's tricky to explain malt to people in ways beyond the, brown malt has more of a chocolatey character, roasted malt has more of a coffee character, pale malt has more of a straw character. Generalities like that, people can understand. But getting into nuances, that's the tough part.
Yeah, and also marketing wise, the words like Citra are like branding more easier than types of malt that nobody's heard from, and that's also not a cool name, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what's Caramunic addiction as opposed to Citra addiction. It's just, it doesn't roll off the tongue the same way.
Yeah. In the food pairing, do you see also in Canada or in other parts of the world a lot of things done with the leftovers of the malt after the brewing? The Spain grains, do people make that into eatables already?
Yeah, definitely. Bread is the big go-to one. But I think there are a lot of possibilities for spent grains beyond what we're doing right now. And every brewer talks about, oh, we have a farmer come and take away our spent grains and blah blah blah. I can't help but believe there's still a lot of spent grain that goes into composting, where it could go into ethanol fuel production. It could go into who knows how many different energy source projects. I think at some point the brewing industry, and certainly more so the big brewers than the small brewers, because they're obviously pulling out a lot more malt. They have to look at, okay, how do we make this an environmentally positive thing, that we've used the sugars in this malt, but we still have the body of it? What can we do with it? What can we make that's more than just compost?
Yeah. And for big brewers going more into energy, and smaller brewers probably more into eatables.
Yeah, definitely. And I've heard of brewery soaps as well, where you have that exfoliating factor of having some malt in them. So there are some interesting ways. Brewers mustard, various sauces. You can use malts after they've been used. You can use the extracts out of even the spent grains to add to flavors to sauces and things. So there are opportunities there.
Yeah. All right, Stephen. Final question a bit. For you as an author, I love this question for brewers, but also for world authors like you. Is there a definition of craft beer? And if yes, what is it?
My favorite way of explaining craft beer is that it's a bit like art or pornography. Nobody knows how to define it, but they know it when they taste it. The reason that I still use the word craft, even as a lot of people are saying we've got to just start talking about beer, not craft beer and major brewery beer, is because craft beer still mean something to the beer consumer. They approach something that's called a craft beer with a sense that they're going to get more flavor than they would out of a major market lager. So in the World Atlas, one of the things we've toyed around with is using the term commodity beer to talk about the big brewery beers, which that's all they are, right? They're commodities. They're beers that are sold for rapid and unthinking consumption. And not that there's anything wrong with rapid and unthinking consumption. I do it from time to time myself. But that's not what you want to be doing all the time. That's not the focus of beer. Beer is a very complex, nuanced, sophisticated, sociable. The adjectives can just keep on coming. So we still talk about craft because it gives that consumer an idea of what you're talking about. But if it's a craft beer, it's going to have more character than a Jupiler, than an Antarctica or a Brahma or a Corona or whatever. And it just raises a level of expectations in people's minds. And so I don't know how to define craft other than saying it's a word that conjures up images in a consumer mind of a flavorful beer.
Yeah, very, very nice words, Stephen Beaumont. Thank you a lot for this interview. And when you pass by Belgium this year or some other time, please let me know. We grab a beer then.
Well, one of the great things about this job is that I have been in Belgium at least once a year, every year since 1998.
Oh.
And as soon as this whole COVID mess is over, I'm hoping to come back again. So maybe we'll be able to have that beer.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot. See you.
Cheers. My pleasure.